The early morning darkness still hung over Harvard University as Sofia Gonzalez and her father, Luis, made their way across the quiet campus. Their footsteps echoed on the cobblestone paths between the old brick buildings that housed some of the brightest minds in the world. Sofia pulled her worn jacket tighter against the February chill while her father unlocked the math building with his large ring of janitor's keys. "Same routine as always, mija," Luis said with a gentle smile, his breath visible in the cold air. "I'll take the second floor. You start with the trash cans in the classrooms down here." At 17, Sofia had been helping her father with his morning cleaning duties since she was 14. The arrangement worked well for their family. She could earn a little extra money before heading to her public high school, and Luis could finish his shift faster to pick up his second job in the afternoons. The math building was Sofia's favorite. Unlike the business school with its coffee spills and carelessly discarded papers, or the humanities building where students left food wrappers tucked between cushions, the math classrooms had a certain order to them. Plus, the whiteboards often contained fascinating puzzles that Sofia couldn't help but study while emptying trash cans. "Don't forget Professor Bennett's room," Luis called over his shoulder as he pushed his cleaning cart toward the stairwell. "But remember, don't erase his whiteboard," Sofia finished, having heard the warning many times before. "I know, Papa." Professor Richard Bennett was a legend at Harvard, known both for his brilliant mind and his terrible temper. He had strict rules about his classroom, especially his precious equations that often remained on the boards for days. Luis had once made the mistake of cleaning a whiteboard containing one of Bennett's proofs 3 years ago. The professor had complained so loudly that Luis nearly lost his job. Sofia pushed her cart down the empty hallway, the wheels squeaking slightly on the polished floor. The sound echoed off the walls decorated with framed mathematical papers and photos of famous Harvard graduates. These halls contained so much history, so much knowledge, and every morning Sofia felt like an invisible ghost, passing through a world that wasn't meant for people like her. When she entered Professor Bennett's classroom, the overhead lights automatically flickered on, revealing the enormous whiteboard that covered the front wall. Usually, Sofia barely glanced at Bennett's work. The complex equations were interesting, but often beyond what she'd taught herself. Today, however, something caught her eye. The board was covered with what looked like a differential equation problem, with multiple steps of work sprawling across the white surface in blue and black markers. Sofia paused in her work, trash bag in hand, and studied the equations more carefully. Math had always been her secret passion. Without money for tutors or special programs, Sofia had taught herself using free online courses, YouTube videos, and math textbooks borrowed from the public library. Sometimes, when the university library was open to the public, she would spend hours there on weekends, hidden in a back corner with advanced calculus books. As her eyes followed Professor Bennett's work across the board, she noticed something that didn't look right. In the middle section, where he was finding the second derivative of a complex function, there was a small error in the chain rule application. Sofia tilted her head, double-checking her mental calculations. "That can't be right," she whispered to herself, setting down her trash bag and moving closer to the board. The error was subtle, something most students wouldn't catch, but it affected everything that followed in the proof. For a moment, Sofia just stared at the board, her heart beating faster. Who was she to question a Harvard professor? A cleaning lady's daughter who attended a struggling public school? The sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall reminded Sofia that she wasn't supposed to be analyzing equations. She was supposed to be cleaning. Quickly, she grabbed a fresh whiteboard marker from the tray and hesitated. Her father could lose his job over this. But the math was wrong. And in mathematics, unlike in life, things could be definitively absolutely wrong or right regardless of who you were. With a racing heart, Sofia wrote in the smallest handwriting she could manage, down in the bottom corner of the board, "Check, second derivative chain rule application at step 4. Missing factor of 2x. She didn't sign it. Who would believe it anyway? But she couldn't walk away from such a clear mistake. Sofia hurried to finish her cleaning duties, emptying the trash can and wiping down the desktop surfaces. As she worked, her eyes kept darting to the small note she'd written. Part of her, wanted to erase it, to protect her father from potential trouble. But another part, the part that stayed up late solving math problems by flashlight, felt a tiny thrill at participating, however anonymously, in this world of ideas. "All finished in here, Papa," Sophia said when she met her father in the hallway. 20 minutes later. "Good work," Luis replied, checking his watch. "Just in time for you to catch your bus." As they pushed their cleaning carts back to the storage closet, Sophia wondered if Professor Bennett would even notice her small correction. Probably not. People like her were invisible here, the ones who emptied the trash and mopped the floors. The professors and students walked past without seeing them, their eyes focused on loftier things. Sophia's public high school was a 30-minute bus ride away, and as she sat looking out the window at the passing streets, her mind drifted back to the equation. She wondered what the full problem was trying to solve. She wondered if the brilliant Harvard students would spot the error during class today. Mostly, she wondered what it would be like to belong in those classrooms, to raise her hand and be called on, to have her thoughts about mathematics matter to someone. The bus rattled over a pothole, jolting Sophia back to reality. She pulled her worn backpack onto her lap and took out her own math homework. The problems on the page seemed embarrassingly simple compared to what she'd seen on Professor Bennett's board. With a sigh, she began working through them anyway. This was her world. Not the hallowed halls of Harvard where she was just a shadow passing through each morning before dawn. Little did Sophia know that her small act of mathematical courage would send ripples through those hallowed halls before the day was done. Professor Richard Bennett's day had started badly and was getting worse. First, his coffee maker had broken, leaving him caffeine-deprived and irritable. Then, he'd gotten stuck in traffic on the way to campus, making him late for his morning office hours. Now, as he stormed into his classroom 10 minutes before his advanced calculus lecture, he was in no mood for surprises. The moment he saw his whiteboard, he knew something was wrong. Someone had touched his work. Someone had dared to write on his carefully preserved equations. He dropped his leather briefcase onto the desk with a loud thud and marched up to the board, adjusting his glasses as he leaned in to examine the small, neat handwriting in the corner. Check second derivative chain rule application at step 4, missing factor of 2x. For a moment he just stood there, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. Then he traced back through his work, following the steps of his proof until he reached the part mentioned in the note. He redid the calculation in his head once, twice. The note was right. There was indeed a missing factor in his chain rule application. Instead of feeling grateful for the correction, Professor Bennett felt his face grow hot with embarrassment and anger. Who had the audacity to correct his work? Surely not one of his students. None of them would dare. Another faculty member, perhaps? The thought made his stomach churn. By now, students were filing into the classroom, taking their usual seats. They sensed the tension immediately, exchanging glances as they noted their professor's rigid posture and flushed face. "Who wrote this?" Professor Bennett demanded, pointing at the note. The classroom fell silent. 22 blank faces stared back at him. "Who came into my classroom and wrote on my board?" More silence. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Professor," a student in the front row finally spoke up, "we just got here. It must have been there since yesterday." Bennett shook his head. "This wasn't here when I left last night. I want to know who wrote this, and I want to know now." When? No one came forward. He stormed out of the classroom and down the hall to the department secretary's office. "Who has access to my classroom outside of scheduled hours?" he demanded. The secretary, a patient woman who had dealt with Bennett's tempers for years, calmly replied, "Only cleaning staff and security, Professor. Is there a problem?" "The cleaning staff? They're not supposed to touch my boards. I've made that perfectly clear. They know the rules, Professor. They wouldn't have erased anything." "They didn't erase, they wrote on it. Someone corrected my work." The words came out in an indignant sputter. The secretary's eyebrows rose slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "I'll call the head of facilities right away." Within the hour, as Bennett's lecture ended, the head janitor arrived at the math department with Luis Gonzalez in tow. The department chair, Professor Chen, had also been summoned, along with 2 other math professors who had heard about the incident. and were curious to see what the fuss was about. Louise stood nervously in the doorway of Professor Bennett's classroom, cap in hand. The head janitor explained that Louise was assigned to this building and would have been cleaning the room that morning. "Did you write on my board?" Bennett demanded, pointing an accusing finger at Louise. Louise shook his head quickly. "No, sir, never. We know the rules. Never touch the boards unless you say it's okay." "Then who did?" Bennett pressed, his voice rising. "Someone wrote on my board this morning, and you're the only one who was in here." Louise swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room full of professors. "My daughter. She helps me sometimes, in the mornings. But she knows the rules too." Professor Bennett's expression shifted from anger to disbelief. "Your daughter? The cleaning girl corrected my calculus?" The other professors exchanged glances. Professor Chen stepped forward, looking at the note on the board and then at Louise. "Your daughter wrote this?" Louise nodded hesitantly. "If someone wrote on the board, it must have been Sophia. But she's good with numbers, very good. She wouldn't mean any disrespect." Bennett let out a sharp laugh. "Good with numbers? This is advanced calculus, not balancing a checkbook." Professor Chen shot Bennett a disapproving look before turning back to Louise. "How old is your daughter?" 17, sir." "And she understood this?" Chen gestured toward the complex equations spanning the board. "She reads math books all the time," Louise said quietly. "From the library. She watches university courses online, too." Bennett paced the front of the classroom. "This is absurd. I want to see this girl. I want to see for myself if the janitor's daughter is secretly a mathematical genius." Louise visibly flinched at Bennett's mocking tone but nodded. "She's in school now at Westridge High. Call her. Get her here," Bennett insisted. "I have another class at 3. I want her here by then." Professor Chen looked concerned. "Richard, is this really necessary? If she found a mistake, I want to see her work through a problem herself," Bennett interrupted. "Anyone can spot a mistake with enough time. Let's see if she actually understands the mathematics." Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the math department. By early afternoon, several faculty members and graduate students had found excuses to be near Professor Bennett's classroom. Some were genuinely curious about the cleaning girl who had corrected a tenured professor. Others were hoping to witness Bennett's humiliation. He had made few friends with his arrogance over the years. At Westridge High School, Sophia was in her English class when the office aide came to get her. "Your father called," the school secretary told her when she arrived at the office. "You need to go to Harvard right away. He said it's important." Sophia's heart sank. Had something happened to her father? Had he gotten in trouble? The bus ride to Harvard was the longest 20 minutes of her life. Her mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. By the time she reached the campus, her hands were shaking. She found her father waiting outside the math building, his face drawn with worry. "Papa? What's wrong? Are you okay?" Louise took her hands in his. "I'm fine, mija. But did you write something on Professor Bennett's board this morning? A correction?" Sophia's eyes widened as she remembered the small note she'd written. Yes. Was that wrong? Did you get in trouble?" "The professor noticed," Louise said. "He wants to see you. Now." As they walked toward the classroom, Louise explained the situation. With each step, Sophia's fear grew. She had never meant to cause trouble. She had never meant to draw attention to herself or her father. Outside the classroom door, she could hear voices inside, more than just one professor. It sounded like a crowd. Sophia froze, suddenly unable to move forward. "I can't go in there," she whispered. Louise squeezed her shoulder gently. "You've done nothing wrong, Sophia. You're smart, smarter than most of these people know. Show them what you can do." Sophia took a deep breath, straightened her public school uniform, and pushed, opened the door to face whatever waited inside. Sophia stepped into the classroom and immediately wished she could disappear. The room was packed, not just with Professor Bennett, but with at least a dozen other professors and graduate students. They all turned to stare at her as she entered. She recognized some of them from her early morning cleaning rounds, though they had never noticed her before. She was still wearing her public school uniform, a simple navy skirt and white blouse that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried her school backpack over one shoulder. Next to the well-dressed academics in the room, she felt painfully out of place. Her father stood protectively close behind her. She could feel his presence like a shield, though she knew there was little he could do if things went badly. Professor Bennett stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, a skeptical expression on his face. He looked Sophia up and down as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "So," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the now silent room. "You're the one who corrected my work?" Sophia swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, sir." "How old are you?" 17, sir." Professor Bennett raised an eyebrow. "And what makes you think you understand differential calculus well enough to correct a Harvard professor?" Sophia's cheeks burned, with embarrassment. She wasn't sure how to answer without sounding disrespectful. I just noticed that there was a factor missing in the chain rule application," she said quietly. "I didn't mean any disrespect." Professor Chen, a kinder-looking man with salt and pepper hair, stepped forward. "Where did you learn calculus, Sophia? Your father says you're self-taught." Before she could answer, Professor Bennett let out a short laugh. "Self-taught? From what, YouTube videos?" Sophia straightened her shoulders slightly. "Yes, actually. And Khan Academy, and MIT's open courseware, and books from the library." Her voice grew a little stronger with each word. "I've worked through most of Spivak's calculus and half of Rudin's principles of mathematical analysis." A murmur went through the room. Those were graduate-level texts, not the kind of books most high schoolers, or even most college students, could understand. Professor Bennett looked unconvinced. Anyone can memorize terms and titles. He turned and erased his previous work from the board, then began writing a new problem, far more complex than the one Sophia had corrected. It involved partial differential equations and vector calculus, topics usually reserved for advanced undergraduate or early graduate courses. When he finished writing, he stepped back and held out a marker to Sophia. "Since you're so eager to show off your mathematical prowess, let's see you solve this." Sophia stared at the problem, her mouth suddenly dry. It was much harder than anything she'd attempted before. She recognized the general form, a partial differential equation with boundary conditions, but some of the notation was unfamiliar. I don't... "As I thought," Bennett said, beginning to turn away. "Perhaps you should stick to emptying trash cans." Professor Chen frowned. "Richard, that's completely inappropriate." But Sophia had already stepped forward and taken the marker from Bennett's hand. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "I'd like to try." The room grew quiet again. Sophia could feel everyone's eyes on her as she approached the board. For a moment, she just stared at the equation, trying to make sense of it. Then slowly she began to write. She started with what she knew, breaking down the problem into smaller pieces. When she encountered notation she didn't recognize, she paused to think about what it might mean from the context. Step by step, she worked her way through the problem. At first, she was painfully aware of the whispers behind her and the weight of Professor Bennett's gaze. But as she continued to work, the mathematics took over. The numbers and symbols became a language she understood, a world where her background didn't matter, where only the logic and beauty of the math counted. She made a mistake at one point and had to erase part of her work. "Sorry," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Then she reapproached the problem from a different angle. Time seemed to stretch. She had no idea how long she had been standing at the board. 5 minutes, 15? The whispers behind her had died down. Now there was only the sound of the marker squeaking against the whiteboard and her own steady breathing. When she finally reached what she believed was the solution, she hesitated, double-checking her work. There was a step in the middle where she wasn't entirely confident, But the final answer seemed right. She circled it and then stepped back from the board. Only then did she turn to face the room. The expressions that greeted her made her breath catch. Professor Bennett was staring at her work with wide eyes, his earlier smugness replaced by undisguised shock. Professor Chen was smiling broadly. Several of the graduate students were frantically taking notes or pictures with their phones. "That's not the approach I would have used," Professor Bennett said slowly. He moved closer to the board, examining her work. "But it's correct. The solution is correct. Her approach is elegant," said another professor Sophia didn't recognize. "Look at how she handled the boundary conditions. I've never seen it done quite that way before." Sophia stood awkwardly, unsure what to do with her hands or where to look. Her father had moved to stand beside her, pride and confusion mingling on his face. "Where did you learn this?" Professor Bennett asked, his voice softer now, the mocking tone gone. "This isn't standard high school curriculum. It's not even standard undergraduate curriculum." Sophia shrugged slightly. "I just figure things out. When I don't understand something, I keep working until I do." "Without any formal training?" another professor asked. "Math makes sense to me," Sophia said simply. "It's like when some people hear music, they can play it back by ear. Numbers and patterns just stick in my head." Professor Chen stepped forward. "Sophia, have you taken the SATs yet?" She nodded. "Last fall." "And your math score?" 800, she said quietly. "A perfect score." Another murmur swept through the room. "Yet you're still at Westridge Public High?" Professor Chen asked, frowning. Sophia glanced at her father. College isn't really an option for us right now." Luis put his hand on her shoulder. "I've been saving," he said. "For community college, maybe." Professor Bennett was still staring at the whiteboard, tracing Sophia's work with his finger. He seemed to be having some kind of internal struggle. Finally, he turned to face Sophia directly. "Young lady," he said, his voice gruff but no longer unkind, "I believe we need to have a serious conversation about your future." The next few weeks passed in a blur for Sophia. After that fateful day in Professor Bennett's classroom, nothing in her life remained the same. That very afternoon, Professor Chen had invited Sophia and her father to his office. He explained that Harvard had special scholarships for exceptional students from disadvantaged backgrounds. With a mind like Sophia's, he said, letting her talent go to waste would be a crime against mathematics itself. "But I haven't even applied," Sophia had protested, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "We'll handle that," Professor Chen assured her. "What we witnessed today was extraordinary, Sophia. In my 30 years of teaching, I've rarely seen such natural mathematical ability." Even Professor Bennett, to everyone's surprise, had become one of Sophia's most vocal supporters. Perhaps it was guilt over his initial rudeness or genuine admiration for her talent, but he'd personally volunteered to mentor her through the application process. Now, 3 weeks later, Sophia sat in the back of Professor Bennett's regular undergraduate class, auditing the course while her application was being processed. Her father had adjusted his cleaning schedule to finish earlier, allowing him to pick her up after these special sessions. Sophia scribbled notes frantically as Professor Bennett lectured. Unlike her high school classes where she was usually bored and restless, here she had to concentrate to keep up. The material was challenging in exactly the way she had always craved. The application of Green's theorem allows us to transform a line integral around a simple closed curve to a double integral over the region inside the curve, Bennett explained, writing equations as he spoke. Sophia felt a thrill as the mathematical relationships unfolded on the board. This was real mathematics, the kind she'd tried to teach herself but had never had proper guidance with. She barely noticed when the other students began packing up their things as the lecture ended. "Sophia, could you stay a moment?" Professor Bennett called as students filed out of the classroom. She approached his desk, still somewhat intimidated by him despite the changes in their relationship. "How are you finding the material?" he asked, organizing his notes. "Challenging," she admitted. "But in a good way." I understood most of it, except the part about differential forms. I need to read more about that. Bennett nodded approvingly. You've been keeping up remarkably well for someone without the prerequisites. He hesitated, then added, The admissions committee meets tomorrow to review your application. Sophia's stomach tightened with anxiety. Do you think I have a chance? Her voice was barely above a whisper. More than a chance, Bennett said. Professor, Chen and I have both written strong recommendations, and your test scores are exceptional. He cleared his throat. There's something else I wanted to discuss with you. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it on the desk. I've been reviewing your solution to the problem I gave you that first day. Your approach was unorthodox. Sophia tensed. Was it wrong? No, quite the contrary. You found a more elegant solution than the standard approach. He turned the folder so she could see his notes. I've been working through your method, and I believe it could be developed into a journal paper. Sophia blinked in surprise. A paper? Like in a real mathematics journal? Yes, with you as the primary author and me as co-author, if you're interested. He leaned back in his chair. It would be unusual for an undergraduate, let alone a high school student, but not unprecedented. It would certainly strengthen your position here. Sophia stared at him, unable to find words. 3 weeks ago, she had been invisible in these halls. Now a Harvard professor was offering to publish a paper with her. I'll need to think about it, she finally managed. Bennett nodded. Of course, discuss it with your father. He gathered his papers. You know, when you corrected my work that morning, I was furious. I couldn't imagine anyone challenging me, least of all. He trailed off, looking embarrassed. Least of all, the janitor's daughter. Sophia finished for him. Bennett had the grace to look ashamed. Yes, I was wrong, Sophia. Not just about the calculus problem, but about you. I've learned an important lesson about making assumptions. Outside, Sophia spotted her father waiting in his old car. As she approached, she could see the pride in his eyes. A look that had been there constantly these past weeks. How was class? Today, mija? Luis asked as she slid into the passenger seat. Good, she said, then told him about Professor Bennett's offer to co-author a paper. Luis listened intently, nodding. Though he didn't understand much about academic publications, he grasped that this was another significant opportunity. Your mother would be so proud, he said quietly. Sophia's mother had passed away when she was 10, after a long battle with cancer that had drained the family's savings and left them struggling. She always said you were meant for great things. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, passing through the neighborhoods that separated Harvard from their small apartment. Papa, Sophia said suddenly, if I get accepted with a scholarship, will you be okay? With me not helping you in the mornings anymore? Luis reached over and squeezed her hand. Sophia, the only reason I would ever want you cleaning those classrooms is if you were the professor, not the janitor's helper. When they arrived home, Sophia found an envelope in the mailbox with Harvard's seal. Her hands trembled so badly that her father had to open it for her. Accepted, Luis read, his voice cracking with emotion. Full scholarship. Sophia sat down heavily on their worn couch, the letter in her hands. The words blurred through her tears. Harvard University was offering her a place, not as a cleaner but as a student. The phone rang, startling them both. Luis answered it, then held it out to Sophia. It's Professor Chen, he whispered. Sophia, Professor Chen's warm voice came through the phone. I hope I'm not the first to tell you the good news. We just got the letter, she said, still in shock. Wonderful. The committee was impressed not just with your mathematical abilities, but with your perseverance in teaching yourself under such challenging circumstances. She listened as he explained details about the scholarship, orientation dates, and housing options. It all seemed so unreal, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. There's one more thing, Professor Chen added before hanging up. Professor Bennett has convinced the department to create a special position for you as a paid research assistant. He says your approach to the boundary value problem shows real promise. After the call ended, Sophia sat beside her father on the couch, both of them too overwhelmed to speak. Through the thin walls of their apartment, they could hear their neighbor's television, the sounds of cooking, ordinary life continuing as it always had. But for Sophia, nothing would ever be ordinary. Again, the door that had seemed forever closed to people like her had unexpectedly swung open, all because she hadn't been able to walk past a mathematical error without correcting it. From cleaning the classrooms to studying in them, Luis said softly, wiping tears from his eyes. This is what I came to this country for, Sophia. Not for myself, but for this moment. Sophia hugged her father tightly, knowing that while her life was changing some things, the most important things would remain constant. No matter what heights she might reach at Harvard, she would never forget where she came from, or the man who had made it all possible with his quiet dignity and unwavering support. 5 years later, Sophia stood at the podium in a packed lecture hall at Harvard, her heart racing as she looked out at the audience. The room was filled with professors, students, and distinguished mathematicians who had traveled from around the world for the annual mathematics conference. In the front row sat her father, Luis, wearing a suit he had bought specially for this occasion, his eyes shining with pride. Thank you all for coming today, Sophia began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 5 years ago, I stood in this very building, not as a presenter but as a cleaner helping my father mop floors and empty trash cans before dawn. A hush fell over the crowd. Many knew parts of her story, but hearing her tell it herself made it all the more powerful. Today I'm honored to present my research on new approaches to boundary value problems in partial differential equations, which has just been accepted for publication in the Journal of Mathematical Analysis. Sophia glanced at Professor Bennett, who sat in the second row. The stern, arrogant man who had once mocked her was now one of her strongest supporters. He gave her an encouraging nod. As Sophia launched into her presentation, explaining complex mathematical concepts with remarkable clarity, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. Her first year at Harvard had been incredibly difficult. Despite her natural talent for mathematics, she had gaps in her education that her self-teaching hadn't covered. She had worked twice as hard as her classmates, staying up late in the library night after night, determined to prove she belonged. Some students had been welcoming, but others had whispered behind her back. Charity case, they called her. Diversity pick. The daughter of the man who cleaned their dorms now sitting beside them in class. Sophia had ignored them, focusing instead on her studies and on the professors who recognized her unique abilities. Professor Bennett, to everyone's surprise, had become her most dedicated mentor. Perhaps seeking to make amends for his initial dismissal of her, he had taken a personal interest in her progress, meeting with her weekly to discuss advanced topics beyond her coursework. Their first paper together, based on the solution she had written on his whiteboard that fateful day, had caused a stir in mathematical circles. A correction of approach to a classic problem, it had shown that sometimes fresh eyes unconstrained by traditional teaching, could see pathways that experts missed. Now, as a graduate student in her final year of a combined bachelor's and master's program, Sophia was presenting her third published paper, this one written primarily by her with Bennett as the secondary author, a complete reversal of their positions from that first publication. As she finished her presentation and answered questions from the audience, Sophia could see the respect in the eyes of mathematicians, whose books she had once struggled to understand. They were treating her as an equal, a colleague, a contributor to their field. When the session ended, Professor Chen approached her. Now the department chair, he had been another consistent supporter throughout her journey. Brilliant presentation, Sophia, he said warmly. The Stanford representatives were very impressed. I think their offer might just get more attractive after today. Sophia smiled. Several top universities had been recruiting her for their PhD programs, a situation she still found somewhat surreal. Thank you, Professor Chen, for everything. She meant it. Without his advocacy that first day, none of this would have happened. As the crowd dispersed, Sophia made her way to her father, who waited patiently at the edge of the room. Did you understand any of it, Papa? She asked with a teasing smile, as they hugged. Luis laughed. Not a word. But I understood that everyone else did and that they thought it was important. His eyes grew serious. Your mother would be so proud, Sophia. So very proud. I know, she said softly. I feel her with me sometimes, especially when I'm working on a difficult problem. They walked together through the campus, a route they had once taken in darkness as they arrived for Luis's early morning shift. Now they walked in sunlight, as equals to anyone else on the prestigious grounds. I have some news, Sophia said as they sat on a bench overlooking the yard. I've been offered a teaching position for next year. Stanford? Luis asked, knowing about the offers she'd been considering. Sophia shook her head. Here at Harvard, Professor Bennett is taking a sabbatical year, and he recommended me to teach some of his undergraduate courses while I begin my PhD. Luis's eyes widened. You would be teaching, in the same classrooms where we once cleaned, yes? Sophia smiled at the symmetry of it. Life takes strange turns, doesn't it? As they continued their walk, they passed the mathematics building where everything had changed 5 years ago. Outside, a group of custodial staff was taking a break, sitting on the steps and drinking coffee. Sophia stopped and greeted them by name. Unlike many professors and students who barely noticed the cleaning staff, Sophia made a point of knowing everyone who maintained the buildings she studied in. Many were immigrants like her father, working long hours to give their children opportunities they never had themselves. One of the younger janitors, a woman named Anna, approached timidly. Ms. Gonzalez? My daughter loves math too. She's in middle school now, but bring her to my office hours, Sophia said without hesitation. I'll help her with whatever she needs. The woman's face lit up with hope, the same hope Luis had carried for years while mopping floors and emptying trash cans, dreaming of a better future for his child. Later that evening, after celebrating with her father at a small restaurant they could now afford without worry, Sophia returned to her campus apartment to find an email from Professor Bennett. Your presentation today reminded me why I became a mathematician in the first place, he wrote. You've taught me as much as I've taught you, perhaps more. The most important lesson being that brilliant minds can be found anywhere, if we only have the wisdom to look. Sophia smiled as she closed her laptop. Tomorrow, she would meet with Anna's daughter, the first of many children of custodial staff she hoped to mentor. She would create a small scholarship fund with part of her new teaching salary, specifically for the children of campus workers. The cycle that had begun with her father's sacrifice would continue, expanding outward to touch more lives. All because one day, a janitor's daughter had been brave enough to pick up a marker and correct a Harvard professor's math. And because, despite his initial arrogance, that professor had been humble enough to recognize that sometimes wisdom comes from unexpected places. Sophia looked out her window at the campus lights glowing in the evening darkness. Once she had been invisible here. Now, she belonged. But she would never forget what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. And she would keep that door open for others to follow. Check your second derivative, she whispered to herself. The words she had written on Professor Bennett's board 5 years ago. It had become her personal motto, a reminder to always question assumptions, to look deeper, to find the hidden errors in accepted truths. Sometimes, the most important corrections in life came from the most unexpected sources.